we are the ultimate learning machine. And one thing I learned from my brain injury is I didn't learn the best in a classroom setting. I learned by doing, by the act of performing. And a lot of people think you have to be Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or General McChrystal to be passion struck. And what I'm trying to showcase is being passion struck is really just trying to become the best version of you that you can be.
Hello and welcome to Along the Way Life's Journey. I'm your host, Carl Buccellato. As I've told you many times, I've traveled millions of miles around this wonderful earth of ours, and I've had the great occasion of meeting some of the finest people you will ever meet. People with answers and people with questions. Today we have a man who's done a similar trek. He's traveled quite a bit. He's a Navy veteran. He's spent many years in the C-suites of the 50 top companies in America, and he went out on his own to determine how he can reach people and help them to improve their lives. He is the host of a fabulous podcast and radio program that's watched and followed all over the world. It's called Passion Struck, and this is John R. Miles. John, welcome to our show.
Hey, Carl, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
It's my honor, believe me. I've read your background here, and you are quite a guy. I must say, you have quite a background and history of having served the country and having reached out in ways to improve other people's lives. And now you've written a wonderful book that's on the bestseller list. Passion Struck. It's an Amazon bestseller, I know. I'm in that company too, so I'm happy for you. So, John, before we get into any other questions and background about how you put your programs together and the messages you bring to people, let's tell our guests, our visitors, a little bit about yourself. Who's John? Where did he start? How did he become John R. Miles?
Well, thank you for that, Carl. I'm going to start my background way back into my early childhood. I was living in Bay Village, Ohio, and we lived at the end of this street with the cul-de-sac, backing up to this large farm behind us. And it was really the perfect environment to be a youngster. And similar to many kids growing up, I loved the game of tag, and we would often play it with our neighborhood friends. And I was about 5 years old, and we were playing between our two houses, and the game, as you probably are aware, got rowdier and rowdier as time went on. And sometimes there are unintended consequences that go with the game of tag, and people get hurt. And that's exactly what happened to me. I was running away from being tagged, and the force of my neighborhood friend pushing me, plus my momentum from running away, launched me in the air. I was unable to catch myself, and I flew through my basement window. And I remember waking up in the hospital bed, realizing that my life was different. I didn't realize at that point how different it was going to be, but I woke up to tubes being in my head trying to pump liquid out because of the pressure that it was putting on my brain. And the ensuing weeks afterwards, I started to realize that something fundamentally had changed inside me. I had developed a speech impediment. I had migraines. I couldn't concentrate. I developed a learning difficulty and a number of other things. And so this was really the first dose of major adversity that I experienced in my life. And it was a powerful moment because for me, over the next couple of years, life was very difficult. And I remember we ended up moving from Bay Village to Palatine, Illinois. And I thought I was going to get this fresh start. But unfortunately, right when we made the move, the injury also caused me to have amblyopia, and I had to wear a patch. And so here you have this kid who speaks differently, can't articulate things, has trouble memorizing, has trouble learning, and now all of a sudden he's in class wearing a patch over one eye. And you can imagine what it was like to be that kid. the kid actually with the broken brain. And about this time, I had this opportunity where the other kids were in their regular English class, where I got to go run across a field. At first, I hated it because I was going to see a speech therapist. But this woman turned out to be more than just a speech therapist. She turned out to be almost like a young life coach to me, and not only told me and taught me how I could overcome my speech impediment, but also that my situation wasn't fixed. And she really said if I had the mindset to do it, I could overcome anything that came my way. And that really transformed my life. And from that point forward, I really took charge of my destiny, got out of victimhood, and really decided that I was going to do something that I felt important with my life and take the road less traveled. And that path then led me to, instead of going to a normal college university, electing to go to the Naval Academy, and then from there becoming a naval officer serving the National Security Agency. And from there, I pivoted into the civilian world, as you said, into first positions in management consulting with a couple companies, Booz Allen, Anderson Consulting. But then after that, propelled my career into senior leadership roles into Fortune 50 companies, and then eventually working in private equity run companies as the CEO for a multitude of those companies. So that's kind of my background and a defining moment that led me there.
Well, that's quite a defining moment, I must say. And, I know that you passed over it as though it's just token to you at this point, and I'm sure it is. But when you're out there and you hear somebody say that they served not only in the military for the security of the nation, but in the top 50 countries and companies and put into CEO capacity in many, many companies. I was a CEO myself of many companies and took a number of them public. I know what a task that is. That isn't something that's easy to do when you step into the role in an existing company. You have to have a great deal of fortitude. You must have sensitivity to people around you. You must be able to gauge those around you and their strengths and weaknesses so that you can use them and deploy them properly. And I'm sure you had those experiences most of your life, of your business life.
I did. I remember the second CEO role I took on. I was real excited about this because I had always been around the technology space, and this was going to be my first opportunity to lead a software development company that also did large data analytics. And I remember walking into this, and I was initially brought in by the board to be the chief operating officer. And within about 2 weeks, I realized that something was fundamentally wrong. The books weren't adding up, things seem inflated, behavior of the CFO and CEO were outrageous in how they were utilizing company funds to throw parties to help with their living expenses, the leases on their cars, etc. And I
So
actually,
you had to become a broom and sweep it clean.
well, I actually resigned because there was so much issue that I said, I'm not going to sit here in a chief operating officer role with all this liability
Right,
around me
right.
with these two. And the board said, we'll get rid of the CFO. You have to go in and assume the CEO and basically fire your boss. And so I went back in, and the situation was far worse than I ever expected. They had been inflating our top line by over 25%, and our EBITDA was in the red. They had been showing that it was positive, and I just couldn't believe that the board hadn't noticed all these things that were happening. But then I get in this role, and the chairman is so upset. He's a multi-billionaire, feels like he has really been betrayed. So he wants to sue the CFO and the CEO. So all of a sudden, I'm trying to turn around this company while in the middle of a lawsuit, while in the middle of being countersued, both personally and professionally. So these are the things people don't think about when they become CEOs of companies.
That's
And
right.
how it can be so much
That's right.
more than you ever thought you were signing up for.
Amazing. But you got through that. You went through the rest of your business career, and passion struck. Now, here's that impasse place in your life when passion struck. That's what I want to hear about.
Carl, I think I have always been passion struck about different things. There was a really key point in my life where I was trying to follow my dreams when I was a youngster of wanting to have this action filled career. And when I got out of the military, I did so only because I got an appointment to become a special agent with the FBI. And I get out of the military, I'm getting ready to move to Quantico, relocate everything. And class is supposed to start on a Friday. It's Monday or Tuesday of that week. And my detailer calls me up and says, I have some unfortunate news for you. Congress cannot pass a budget. Now, we hear this all the time now, but this was really one of the first times during the Clinton administration when this transpired. And so my class got recycled. And I was really naive. I thought when they told me it was going to be recycled, I was looking at maybe a couple months delay. Turned out
Yeah,
to be
like the word
close.
furlough, right?
Yes. Turned out to be closer to 40 months. And at that point, life from that standpoint had passed me by because I had to take a plan B. And I think sometimes when life throws these things at you, you don't realize the runway and where it takes you until you're in the middle of it. And that's where I found myself. And I was doing extremely good in these jobs, but I guess I never imagined as a youngster that I was ever going to be sitting behind a desk doing that type of career. And while I was at Lowe's as a senior executive, I started to hear this inner voice inside telling me that I wasn't on the right path. And I think, like a lot of people, I kind of ignored it because things externally seemed great. I had a great title, I was making good money, was getting accolades, lived in a great neighborhood, had the car I always wanted, everything else. And so I kept going down this course. And over time, I found myself growing deeper and deeper into what Henry David Thoreau calls quiet desperation. And I think this is more prevalent today than many of us think. And it ends
I
up
agree.
making you feel this huge lack of fulfillment, like you're spending days in monotonous meetings, just doing emails and presentations that drain rather than inspire. And that's exactly what was happening to me. And I kept going down the path I was going, even though I recognized I needed to change. And in some ways, looking back, I wish at that point at Lowe's, I would have made that change. But I think in some ways, my ego got the better of me because a C level role opened up in a Fortune 50 company. And I just felt, how can I possibly turn this down? But that experience turned out to be really a wake up call for me because I went from really a high growth mindset environment when I was at Lowe's to one that was really a fixed mindset in this company. And I found myself falling further and further into this area of quiet desperation, eventually reaching a point where I felt numb. And that really I was waking up in the morning, and it's hard to even describe, but I remember waking up and feeling like, why am I doing any of this? None of it feels like I'm making a significant difference in anyone's life. I don't feel like I matter to anyone. And it was really the low point of my life. And this is before that CEO role. And I think this is the trap so many people find themselves in is we find ourselves living this life. We have all these material possessions, what we think is success, but inside we feel unhappy and unfulfilled. And kind of what happened to me is it finally reached an apex in 2017 after I had done that CEO role and I was working for another company where I went out just like I would every single morning, dropped my daughter off at school, went to the gym. This day, though, was a little bit different. The gym had an electrical fire, and it caused me to go home earlier than I expected. And I ended up walking in on a home robbery that they had planned and had scouted me and had not anticipated that I would walk in on. And so I'm confronted not only with a home burglary, but with the burglar pointing a gun at me. And I successfully escaped the situation. And then a few days later, I remember that weekend, this happened on a Tuesday. I was spending the Saturday with my best friend, kind of talking about what had happened and how much it was not only personally affecting me from the trauma that it invoked, but it had also reopened a whole bunch of wounds that I had experienced in combat as well. And unfortunately, about 24 hours later, my friend took his life. And those two things compounding really hit me like nothing has ever hit me before. And it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that life is so finite. And why do I keep resisting to make this change? And I just made the choice that things had to change. And so Passion Struck didn't start there. It really had started before that. But after that point, I really went into a couple years of just deep soul searching that really led me to this conclusion that just as I felt like I didn't matter, like I wasn't feeling fulfilled, like I had faced quiet desperation, there are actually millions and millions of people who feel the same way.
Absolutely.
And so
Absolutely.
that's what led me to Passion Struck because to me it was the opposite. I felt completely apathetic to life. I felt unintentional about what I was doing and like I was living the life of a pinball where I was just bouncing off things rather than being intentional about how I was controlling my life. And so that really became the genesis of what I'm trying to do now with the Passion Struck movement.
Well, that's a great foundation. And, I was listening to you and remembering myself and reminding myself, I'm a great deal older than you and I have a similar background than you. But I reminded myself that when I was young and vigorous and there was activity and action, I always felt like I was contributing something. But after the action was completed and the businesses in business world, when the businesses became successful and they grew in stature, you're like this lifeboat. What do they call it? A tower in the sea where the light comes on when there's a storm and it sits down and it's useless when there's no storm. And I had times myself in my life when I said to myself, "What is your purpose? What are you accomplishing? What are you contributing?" And I really thought that I had nothing left to give. But it wasn't until for me personally, it was finding my faith and finding that I have a deeper purpose in life and that there was something more for me to give and to receive from humanity. Not only to give, but to receive back. And that was that was a turning point in my life. I remember somebody saying to me once, what would you do if somebody put a gun to your head and said, you have to do this? And I didn't want to tell them those things happened to me. Those of us who wear uniforms know those things. These things happen to many of us. You don't have to wonder what you would do. The question is not that. The question is, what do you do in your daily life? And the little incidental things as you go through life, when you get up in the morning, what do you do to recognize you have a contribution to make and you can validate and assist somebody else along the way? Those are the answers, the questions that I sought answers for. I found them in my faith. There are many, many people who find them in many different ways. Sounds like you found them in a very assertive way by bringing the message to other people.
As I look back upon that time at Lowe's, I have come to realize that that voice I was hearing was actually the voice of God talking to me. And I think what ends up happening is we are each made very uniquely. There's no one in the world who is as unique as each one of us are. And I think what we fail to realize when we look in the mirror is that we are the most incredible person that we will ever meet. And every person can say that because we're each unique in our own way and gifted. And we're put on earth, I believe, to fulfill a destiny if we truly listen and search out what that purpose is, and most importantly, how to utilize it to benefit humanity. And what I came to realize during this time was that I had spent almost 2 decades or over 2 decades of my life making other people's dreams come true, making other people a lot of money, but I wasn't making my own dreams come true, and I wasn't using my inherent talents to serve the world to make it better. And that was the gap that I had been ignoring. And I think it's a difficult gap to cross because when you have this defined path that's right in front of you, and for me, I knew what that defined path was. It was continuing to work for these big companies or these private equity run companies. And that's an easy to understand defined path. When you're given this other path, where the words that I was being told were, I want you to go help the beaten, broken, bored, battered, lonely, and helpless of the world, you're kind of sitting here as a senior executive going, what the heck does that mean? And how do I
Right.
do it? And so the first thing we want to do is just resist and not double down. But I swear to anyone who's listening, if you did what I did, start quieting your mind, start spending time with yourself and really understanding what that calling is that you're getting, and then trying to figure out what is the problem that you're being called to solve, you will get the answers if you listen and put yourself into a position where you open your mind to hear. And I think we're so distracted, just like I described with the pinball, by everything around us that fewer and fewer of us are truly putting ourselves in that position to hear that calling.
I agree with you. And one of the things that I realize also is, and I'm going to ask your opinion about this, it seems that this nation, and I don't want to get into politics, but this nation has turned around so much in the last number of years from people who had a certain set of values and virtues and beliefs in their life, and they aspired to live those things and to share them and to raise their children with those same virtues and to give a hand to their neighbor and their brother where possible. And then somehow, I don't know whether the world, for some of us at a certain level, the world just got easier and we started getting the comforts of modern time and we started making more money than anybody ever should even dream of making. And he gave us all the things that we never thought we'd have in life. And this, many people took that on to be the new drive, their new passion, their new place to go, to aspire more, to go to the different country club, to have friends that would go on European vacations with them. And at the same time, their children were being lost along the way, and their values as human beings were being lost along the way. And to me, this is the biggest waste of America that's happened in the last 50 to 80 years, that our natural resources were always thought to be the material things, the wood, the energy, the electricity, the metals. But our natural resources that we had was always the American person himself and the spirit to thrive, to be bigger and better. And yet, the news comes in and tells us, oh no, we shouldn't think this way. And the politicians come in and tell us, just reach out for something more. It's all there. We just seem to have lost our way. You just quoted the road less traveled. Maybe more of us should start to travel that road again.
Yeah, it's very interesting. At the beginning of my book, Passion Struck, in the first chapter, I lay out this gap that you're describing. And it's a really scary gap. Starting around the late 1970s and into the 80s, a profound shift happened. And you can look at this if you look at census data. I looked at the Kaufman Report, Brookings Institute, and what they all are showing is that up until that point, we were really a country that was focused on entrepreneurship, starting small businesses, starting and taking charge and being having the courage to do something different. And something changed. About this point, people started to think it's safer to take a job with one of these big companies than it is to go out and pursue the different track. And if you look at what's transpired over that course of time that you're talking about, it almost looks like a triangle where on one side the amount of people who are going in to these large institutional jobs is on this forever incline, and in inverse, the number of people who are starting their own jobs, pursuing entrepreneurship, is almost in a indirect decline, and the gap is just continuing to grow. And the scary thing for me is it's not just here in the United States, it's in
It's
almost every
global.
western country.
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
And so I think we're at the point right now where time tends to be cyclical. And I think we are at an inflection point where things are going to change. And just like during the beginning of the industrial age, people before that were typically, I guess, solopreneurs. You could think of them being blacksmiths or whatever they
Yeah.
might have done.
Yeah.
I think we're
Yeah.
about ready to re-enter that, but we're going to enter it with the skill sets being around technology. And so I think,
I
yeah,
go ahead. I agree with that. I think that in addition to that, I think that there's going to be the pendulum is swinging back away from academia with all its falseness of having to pay huge sums of money to get degrees that can't perform for you any longer. And all these younger people who are recognizing that if they went to trade schools, they could start their own businesses and have a much more comfortable life. That pendulum is swinging back right now.
no, I remember when my son was graduating high school, he had a friend who had gotten into UVA. His father, both his parents were doctors, and his father, in addition to being a podiatrist, was also an entrepreneur developing technologies to help aid in treating ailments. And he told his son that instead of going to UVA and me spending $250,000 on your education, I will give you the choice of me using that $250,000 to be your seed funding to start your own business. And he was trying to tell his son that he's going to learn far more being an entrepreneur and trying to start something than he ever will getting his bachelor's degree. And to me, it was a really interesting look at, I think, the whole education system, which really started during the Rockefeller years, has been made in many ways to bring us into more commonality instead of exploiting
Absolutely.
our uniqueness. And so I
Absolutely.
tend to agree with you that I think what people really need to start looking at is the thing that differentiates our species from anyone else is that we are the ultimate learning machine. And one thing I learned from my brain injury is I didn't learn the best in a classroom setting. I learned by doing, by the act of performing. And so these trade schools and being an apprentice, all these things that generations before me kind of grew up in, that you had to be an apprentice, you had to learn these skill sets, that has completely gone away. And I think the generations that have come after me all want to go from point A to point B overnight without really learning the hard skills to get there. And I think
And they don't
we're
want to pay their dues. They
coming
don't want to pay.
around to that, going back to the way it was.
I completely agree with you. We look at how the education system has been politicized in many ways and linked together with the media's propaganda, teaching people that their life has to be in a certain way, and that the old histories of America, with all its stories of success and the Paul Bunyans of this world, and the people who really got dirt under their fingernails and built something for the future, that was it non-essential any longer. They were talking about all these esoteric things that had nothing to do with the reality of the United States, and more people began to believe it. And as they believed it, they surrendered to it. People like you are necessary to remind them not to surrender, to recognize their own innate value. That when you have a passion and you have a dream, Nothing can surpass that dream if you go after it and you make it happen. You're talking about a guy who grew up in Brooklyn, very little of anything, grew up poor, had nothing in my life. I was dyslexic as a kid, couldn't read, just like you're talking about, all those reverse brain things. As it happened later on in life, I had a hemorrhagic stroke, a half-inch bleeder in my brain, had to learn how to speak and act and build all over again, just the things you're talking about. But one thing that I always knew in life, if I put my mind to something, it's going to get done because I'm never going to quit until I get it done. Winston, one of my favorite heroes in history was Winston Churchill. He had a 5 word secret to success. I'm sure you've heard of it before. He went on the radio during the Blitzkrieg in London and he told the British people while they were being bombed night after night by the German. And he said, if you follow these 5 words, we will succeed. We will win. Never, 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 never quit. Never quit. And I've lived my life with that. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm interviewing
No,
you, and I'm
no.
impending in
I
my own
no. I
thoughts.
mean,
But
Winston Churchill actually means a lot to me. I actually wrote about him in the 13th chapter of my book on the importance of being a conscious engager. And I focused on him because if you look at his life, and in this chapter, I also talked about Abraham Lincoln, we tend to look at each one of those tremendous leaders from the lens of what they did at the twilight of their career. However, if you look at both of them earlier on in their career, in the case of Abraham Lincoln, he self described himself as a piece of driftwood just going from one side of the riverbed to the other without
right,
having any intentionality in his life until he found the cause to eradicate slavery. And similar, Winston Churchill had a whole bunch of huge, colossal blunders on his way before he became prime minister. But during that moment, he found that purpose and that perseverance and that intentionality. And he was the right person at the right time who saved the United Kingdom from what could have easily been a completely different history. And my father
absolutely.
is a huge fan of Winston Churchill as well. And I grew up with a painting of him in his study. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, he was a great man, and I also learned a lesson early in life that when you find any great man who's been a success and achieving wonderful things, when you look into his history, you will find a succession of failures because nobody goes to that one great success. There's always steps you take, there's always attempts that you make. Some of them succeed, they move you further up the ladder, some of them fail. There's always the one thing in common is you have a passion about what you're doing and you make a decision and you act on it. If you don't act on it, nothing will ever happen.
Yeah, it's interesting on that point. I interviewed Jim McKelvey for my book, who some of the listeners may know, may not know. They would definitely know his co founder, Jack Dorsey, but the two of them founded Square. And Jack and Jim tell me that as they mentor entrepreneurs today, and the entrepreneurs ask them, what gets in the way of companies who don't break through and what makes a unicorn different? They both tell them that what ends up happening is you have this problem that you find that you uniquely can solve, but then hardship comes around. It might be you're having trouble getting funding in for the business, or it doesn't seem like your idea is resonating. And so many people give up on their original idea or get distracted and try to take it down different paths. And they said if they would just int- be intentional about bringing that problem to light and figuring out how to solve it and staying with it. But so many people give up or switch direction instead of looking at it and finding alternate ways to go about it. And you think about just Square and where it is today, but what you don't hear is the whole backstory of how every financial institution and the federal government tried to shut them down every single step of the way. And they had to navigate disappointment after disappointment before they eventually succeeded.
Absolutely. I have some history in a couple of companies that uh, became unicorns themselves. The last one was started in 1997, and when we went public in 2011, they wouldn't let us on the New York Stock Exchange because we hadn't reached the 50 million criteria yet. We were only at 49 million six, and so they wouldn't let us go public on the New York Stock Exchange. And we had a breakout year after we went public on American. And the next year, they invited us to come to the New York Stock Exchange. And we were the number one producing company in the New York Stock Exchange. And went on to become a unicorn. And it was sold multiple times. And now it's ICE, owned by the New York Stock Exchange. That's the company. So stick to your knitting is basically what you have to do. You got to stick to what you know is right and just keep driving through. Well, we're getting, we haven't even gotten onto your show yet, and the people that you have, and the passions that they bring forward, and how they have stories to tell other people to help them to change and grow. So I'm sure you'd like to speak a little bit about that.
Sure, Carl. I mean, that's very nice of you to give me that opportunity. I started Passion Struck, the podcast, really because I had an idea that I wanted to get a message out, but I didn't know how to do it. I originally thought about writing a book and that would be the entryway into it, but I'm sure similar to things that you've seen in your own career, being a corporate guy, I never built a personal brand because it just wasn't the approved. And so when I started talking to book agents, they said, none of these publishers are going to want you. You don't have a platform. You don't have a personal brand. How
Right.
do you even know anything you have to say is going to resonate? And no one's going to hire me to public speak because I didn't have the brand. And so I decided that the best way for me to try out these concepts, especially in the middle of COVID, was to start a podcast as well as a blog and see if any of it was resonating. And luckily, it has. And to me, the real apex of what I'm trying to do on the podcast, which ironically is a health podcast, and people sometimes ask me, how could isn't it a self development podcast? Why are you in the health space? I'm in the health space because everything that we want to change in our life really focuses on being intentional about behavior change. So if you want to have better health, it's about the actions that you're taking and the foods you're eating, being intentional about the exercise you're doing, the sleep you're getting. If you want to have better mental health, it's the same thing. Relationship health, the same thing. Career health, and the line, and it goes on and on and on. So I interview through the lens of being intentional and becoming passion struck. And I've been really fortunate to have a couple fairly large names who initially took a chance on me, which attracted more large names to the podcast. So I've had everyone on from yesterday, Ryan Holiday. I've got Gary Vaynerchuk coming up on the podcast, but I've interviewed Admiral Stavridis, General McChrystal, 6 or 7 astronauts, and a whole slew of behavior scientists and New York Times bestselling authors. And all those are great, but my favorite episodes that I do are those with everyday heroes who I think are making a meaningful contribution to the world. And I love to give them a large stage where people can hear about the impact they're making. And so a great example of that is an episode that I'm putting out this week with a gentleman named Noam Platt. Noam is a healthcare architect down in New Orleans. And what this young gentleman is doing is he is an adjunct professor, but he's partnered with LSU and Tulane University to make assistive technologies for disabled kids and adults. And it is amazing the lives that he is changing by using 3D printing and finding new ways to bring comfort to people whose lives are very difficult, whether that's building a wooden apparatus with wheels for a child who's missing a limb so that they have a way to get around, or building a mobile toilet for someone who is disabled so
Wonderful.
that their parents can take them more places and they can experience more normalcy in life. It's those type of stories that I love to do because it is really people who are living out being passion struck. And a lot of people think you have to be Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or General McChrystal to be passion struck. And what I'm trying to showcase is being passion struck is really just trying to become the best version of you that you can be. And what it all boils down to is if you can positively impact one person's life, what you don't see is what just doing that ends up unfolding in unknown ways to you, and how that gesture impacts so many more people than just that one.
It's
And we
it's called a ripple effect. It's what happens when you
exactly.
come across a pond that's stagnant and you drop a pedal in the middle. Wave after wave after wave after wave. It's the ripple effect. It's like the old movie "It's a Wonderful Life," when he said he had no reason to be alive and he didn't want to be alive, and the angels showed him what the world would have been if he hadn't been alive. All the people he'd impacted along his life. Very important stuff. Very important.
Yeah, and I thank you for bringing that up because I think we tend to think in our head that to make a difference, it's got to be this huge movement or something large that we do. But I was talking to this woman named Jen Bricker Bauer, who some people may know. Jen was born without legs and is now an aerialist and a public speaker and a New York Times bestselling author. But she really talks about how she was growing up. She was adopted, and her parents, instead of treating her as a person with no limbs, basically just put it into her mind that anything is possible. And that's the message that she tries to give out. And she was the first non able bodied person to win the state championship in Illinois in tumbling. She was the leading act for the Britney Spears world tour. And it goes on and on. But
Amazing.
and yeah, and her mom told her that all you need to do, Jen, is impact one person, and that ripple effect that you talk about will occur. And now she's impacted millions of people.
I did a show with a young woman by the name of Zabine Becker. Zabine Becker was a thalidomide baby. In the 1960s and early 70s, Germany had a pharmaceutical that it would give to pregnant women to avoid nausea and sleeplessness. They didn't realize the effect it would have. As a result of that, tens of thousands of children were born disformed. She was born disformed. And she lived in Germany at the time, of course, with her parents. And the German mentality was these are useless people, put them in an institution and forget about them. But the mother and father loved her, taught her that she's capable of anything. And today she's a accomplished author, a speaker to the masses. She's a grandmother with three children. She drives her own car. You know, she does everything you can conceivably think of doing. And she always has this magnificent smile on her face, recognizing that tomorrow she will reach one more person. To
Yeah,
me, that's an inspiration. See,
it's
that's
a
a
wonderful
hero.
story. Yeah, it's a wonderful
That's a
story.
hero. Okay, well, we're down to the end of our time. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to say to the folks anything you'd like, and then I'll do a close. And firstly, I want to tell you, I thank you so much for coming on this show. I really feel honored that you did. You have a wonderful message for people to hear, and I feel a certain simpatico with you because we've walked along a lot of similar lines, but you're a very wonderful man. So I want to thank you for everything that you're doing.
Oh, thank you so
Now,
much
talk to the
for.
folks.
Yeah, I think the message I want to leave you with is Mark Twain's quote that 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did. And I'll back this up with Cornell University 2018 unleashed studies that were led by psychologist Tom Gilovich that revealed a profound truth. When asked about their biggest life regrets, thousands of individuals that Cornell ended up interviewing all had the same response. A staggering 76% of the participants cited not fulfilling their ideal self was their biggest regret. And it highlights that our deepest regrets are not tied to the mistakes that we make in life, but to the what ifs and the should haves, the echoes of the ideal lives we never pursued. And my point of this to anyone who's listening who might think they're too old to make a change, or too stuck in their ways to make a change, or something else, I want to leave you with this story. I recently, in the past month, lost a sibling to pancreatic cancer. And my sister was an incredible fighter. In the middle of fighting stage 4B pancreatic cancer, she had an unrealized passion that she always wanted to be a therapist. And so, while undergoing chemotherapy and other treatments, she put herself through a master's program at the University of Texas in social work and spent the last 2 years of her life practicing as a practicing social worker, transforming profound lives who were in the deepest points of despair, but found solace in my sister because they could see in her how she was navigating her own hardship, and it gave them hope. And I tell my sister's story because we put all these dreams in life to the wayside thinking that we don't have time to do it, when it doesn't matter how old we are or what state we're in. If we have the will, there's always a way to do it and to live a life where you don't reach that point that this study showed, where 76% of us feel like we didn't take the chances that we should have earlier in life. And I want to try to help as many people as I can to break free from being part of that 76% and to live their lives in a different way.
It's a great attribute. So, folks, go for the gusto. You heard John say a few minutes ago, we're each of us unique. We're all created by God in a unique fashion. Our fingerprints, like snowflakes, they're no duplicates. We're all unique. And I remind you of what I tell you every week. We all have our own story. You have a story. Tell your story. Write it down. Tell your loved ones. Tell your family. Tell your friends. Submit it to different organizations so they can hear your story and your information. Because when it's too late, it's too late. All that wisdom is gone. Share it for the sake of the world today. Tell your story. Share your message. Share your truth with others. And I want to say to you what I say every week. I know I'm this big blustery guy from Brooklyn. What do I know? I know one truth. Get somebody you know today, wrap them in a bear hug, and tell them you love them. Tell them you love them because it may be the only time they hear those words in their life. And I'm quite sure God does too. Tell them you love them. So, John, I want to tell you today, you know what's coming. I love you, man.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks for coming on our show, and we'll do it again.